The title of my talk is Communication Revolution and the Epical Crisis, Capitalism's Creative Destruction of the Economy, the Environment, and the Cultural Apparatus. Just a sec, I'm going to turn move this computer. The term epical crisis was introduced by Jason Moore, an environmental historian, to talk about periods in which economic crisis and environmental crisis intersect in human history. And of course, in this sense, we are facing the greatest epical crisis of all time, where we're confronted with a planetary ecological crisis and an economic malaise that on a scale that hasn't been seen since the Great Depression. So we can talk about these two phenomena as somehow intersecting. The economic crisis might itself be characterized as the interaction between monopolization trends, stagnation trends, and financialization trends, all feeding into each other at the present time, coupled with what we call the global labor arbitrage, that is, the restructuring of production globally and its migration to areas of cheaper labor with lower unit labor costs. At the same time, we have an ecological crisis, which is characterized by the crossing of planetary boundaries. The most important of these, of course, is climate change, but it's only really one of the planetary boundaries that we're crossing. And we're in a situation where the safe operating space for humanity is being eroded. In a broader sense, we can talk about the epical crisis as one that takes the form of the growing displacement of use value. And if we look at it in terms of the economic crisis, one of the central characteristics of our time, of what I call monopoly finance capital, is the financialization process, which isn't just about financial crisis. What it represents is a shift, an unprecedented shift over 3 or 4 decades towards finance, so that finance for 3 and 4 decades has become a larger and larger part of the overall economy, and financial profits have become a larger and larger part of profits as a whole. This is entirely unprecedented in the history of capitalism. And so it's this trend, which takes the form, of course, of financial bubbles and the bursting of these financial bubbles, with each one getting bigger than the one before, which is the problem that we face and we have to understand in that respect. In Marxian terms, we can talk about it in terms of, if you look at Marx's general formula for capital, MCM prime, that is money, commodity, and then more money, which is the general formula for how capital works. The object is always to produce more money. But commodities are in the middle of the process. Normally, it's understood you have to produce commodities. But we're switching towards an economy that takes the form of M prime, where its money produces more money without the intervention of commodities to a large extent. That doesn't mean that we're not still using a lot of the world's resources, and we're not still involved in commodity production. But the profits are more and more coming from the financial sector, which is divorced from the real economy, what we call the real economy or production. So we could say that we have a shift from the real economy to the financial economy or speculation. And that means that what we call the real economy or production is and the whole realm of use values is being displaced to a large extent, which is central to this crisis. But we have another thing that's going on at the same time. Environmentalists sometimes talk about, Howard Odum, the greatest system ecologist in the 20th century, was very influenced by Marx and talked about it in these terms. Environmentalists sometimes talk about the nature in terms of natural material use values, or natural material values being real values. That is, nature, and this is central to Marx's thinking, nature's role in the production of use values is obviously critical in the production of all wealth. It's the basis of all wealth, and human economy is simply part of that. And what we are seeing is the destruction of what environmentalists sometimes call real value, or natural material values, or nature, external nature, and this is being destroyed in order to promote exchange value, in order to promote profits, in order to expand the commercial economy, and often in the context of producing all kinds of forms of waste and destruction and so on. So we have a shift in the economy that from a displacement of use value in the sense that the real economy, as they call it in economics, is becoming less important, and real value in the sense of nature is becoming less important. And we're entering a much more irrational world, which is really at the center of this crisis. Now, the other part of my title, where I refer to communication revolution, really needs no particular definition for this audience, but Robert McChesney writes in his Digital Disconnect that Google's Eric Schmidt estimates that if one digitally recorded all extant human cultural artifacts and information created from the dawn of time until 2003, one would need 5 billion gigabytes of storage space. By 2010, people created that much data every 2 days. So we're in the middle of a communication revolution. Now, the great paradox here, at least in terms of what I want to talk about, is how can we have a communication revolution, one of the greatest technological revolutions in the history of humanity, in all of history, that has enormous economic effects. How can we have this kind of communication revolution that has become part of everyone's lives, and at the same time have this epical crisis where the economic system is stagnating, where the real economy is in many ways falling apart, where we have this global labor arbitrage while we're destroying the entire planet? Was this supposed to be the way was this what we were told? Is this the way it was supposed to happen? I seem to remember that the communication revolution, high technology, was supposed to have spurred the whole economy, spurred it to an extent that we had a new world of endless economic prosperity. Isn't that what Wired magazine told you? So why the stagnation? Why this very severe economic crisis in the midst of this technological revolution? And wasn't it supposed to be that the communication revolution created a weightless world where we use less paper and we use less commodities and so on, that all our environmental problems were solved? We had less toxics and everything else. Wasn't this supposed to happen? At least that's what they were saying in the 1990s. Bill Gates came out with a book where he talked about friction-free capitalism. I wrote a nasty comment on it at the time, but nobody talks about friction-free capitalism as a result of the communication revolution now. So what happened? I wanted to approach this series of questions. Well, first of all, First of all, I wanted to emphasize that I think that there is some kind of a parallel between what is happening with respect to the economy and the environment and what's happening with respect to communication. And in the broad epical crisis, just as we can talk about a shift in use values and with respect to the environment and the economy, this displacement of use values, this increasingly irrational world, this is happening in some ways with respect to communication itself, even with these technological innovations, in fact, by means of them, so that we're seeing a shift of a world of real communication to a world of virtual communication, from real communication where humanity, to quote Protagoras, is the measure of all things, to a commercially mediated system in which communications are little more than an appendage of the capital markets. I mean, this is happening very, very rapidly. The speed with which the internet is becoming a digital space occupied by monopolies, and the speed with which it's being commercialized it's the speed of light itself. Nobody, even the most severe critics, thought that the internet and the web and the whole digitalized revolution could become incorporated into the capitalist commodity economy as fast as it has been, and the creation of monopoly markets. So we have these giant, communications monopolies now that are almost impregnable. Well, I wanted to talk about this whole problem by looking at Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction. And Schumpeter, of course, took the, Joseph Schumpeter was a conservative economist, conservative Austrian economist who ended up at Harvard, one of the two greatest economists of the 20th century, along with Keynes. And he took his notion of creative destruction from Marx, of course, with Marx, particularly the Communist Manifesto, but also from Capital. Marx talked about the incessant revolutionization of the means of production, the destruction of capital, the devalorization of capital, the replacement of old capital and old technology by new capital as central to the whole operation of capitalism as a system of accumulation. Marx didn't base his analysis on the notion of competition. He based it more on the accumulation. He based it on the accumulation process and the notion of the revolutionization of the means of production. And of course, all of this was rooted in a system of class. But he understood capitalism in those terms, and Schumpeter took much of that over. Schumpeter first introduced some of these ideas in pre-1914 era in his theory of economic development. But the early 20th century saw the development of monopoly capital, that is, giant corporations that were already beginning to dominate whole nations and looked like they were going to dominate the world. And Marxist theorists were developing theories of monopoly capitalism. Schumpeter was a conservative economist, but worked with the Austrian Social Democrats and was part of these conversations, was very disturbed by these developments, the development of monopoly capital, because his original theory was about capitalism based on the entrepreneur, the innovating entrepreneur, who is essentially an individual. And that was his notion of where the dynamism of capitalism came from. But already by the late 1920s, it was clear to him that this world was disappearing. So in 1928, he wrote his piece, The Instability of Capitalism, where he talked about the growth of monopoly capital and, or trustified capitalism, and how it was destroying the entrepreneur, and he took this idea from Marx. I'll explain this, how the very capitalist process was destroying the institutional framework of capitalist society. And in 1942, in Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, he re-entered the debate on this. It grew out of the great debate on stagnation in the 1930s and the debates over monopoly capital and Marxism and Keynesianism. Schumpeter was very disturbed by the growth of the revival of, the growth of Marxist analysis in the United States. The most famous figure being Paul Sweezy, who was Schumpeter's closest friend and younger colleague. And the growth of Marxism in the United States. He was also disturbed by the growth of Keynesian doctrines. He was disturbed by the concern at the time about the decline of price competition and price rigidity and the growth of monopoly, and the arguments that were being made at the time that this all was creating a tendency to stagnation. And so he developed his argument on creative destruction in capitalism, socialism, democracy to counter this. And he said he was trying to, in some ways, defend the idea of monopoly or large capital, showing to some extent its rationality. And so Schumpeter stopped talking about the entrepreneur because the entrepreneur no longer really existed, but he talked about the creative destruction as an abstract process now embodied in corporations. And he said that the corporations innovate, they technologically innovate, they introduce new methods, new forms of organization, new products, and that this kind of creative destruction, which is not really what economists normally think of when they think of competition, prevented any long-term monopoly positions developing and persisting. That monopoly capital couldn't really exist on any kind of a long term because of creative destruction. He said this creative destruction is superior to other forms of competition, like a bombardment is superior to forcing a door. And so he argued that, and then he turned around, and conservatives love him for this, and he kind of rationalized the destruction of capital, which Marx had always said was inherent in the system, and emphasized its necessity, in which, of course, neoliberalism has adopted many of his points in this respect. But he turned around. I mean, first of all, he said that monopoly wasn't the danger, so we don't need to have all this antitrust legislation and so on, that creative destruction will take care of it in that respect, that it's not going monopolies aren't going to slow down the economy, and from an economic standpoint. And he said that he turned around and he defended monopolistic practices, and he said that higher prices and lower output were sometimes very rational in terms of establishing new technologies and making sure that certain corporations could solidify themselves within the perennial gale of creative destruction, establish themselves, and so on. So he defended all sorts of monopolistic practices, using creative destruction as a way of doing this. But he made it very clear that he was, and he used this also to attack the theory of vanishing investment opportunities associated with Alvin Hansen and with some Marxist analysis. And he made it very clear that his argument was primarily against Marxists, but also against Keynesians. But there was another part of Schumpeter's concept of creative destruction, which he also took from Marx, and at least in his own statements on this. He actually saw creative destruction as standing for the larger capitalist process. And he talked about basically the creative destruction of capitalism himself. Capitalism itself, the creative destruction of capitalism itself. He argued in the next part of his book, and it was part of his overall argument, that capitalism destroyed the institutional framework on which it rested. And he argued that this was Marx's argument too, that Marx didn't think that capitalism failed for economic reasons, but basically for sociological reasons. Labor rising up, concentration of capital, socializing the system, etc. And Schumpeter argued that capitalism, through its own process, through its creative destruction, destroyed its own institutional framework. For example, he said it removed all of the protective strata, the aristocracy, the classes that protected the capitalist class and rationalized things in a way that the capitalist class never really could, and provided charisma and long-term views. The whole protective strata of capitalist society gets destroyed. Another point he made that he emphasized was that intellectuals become increasingly anti-capitalist. And he used Paul Sweezy in the famous debates on stagnation in the 1930s as the primary example of this. Paul Sweezy stood for the fact that intellectuals tend to go into a radical direction, and that capitalism, in this way and in other ways, undermines the institutional framework in which it exists. That the giant corporations themselves become big bureaucracies that control innovation, and they let the small enterprises develop the innovations, then they take them over and they institute them according to their own profit mechanisms. So we saw monopoly at capital as part of the undermining of the institutional framework of the system, the sociological framework of the system, even though it wasn't, in his view, an economic failure. So he argued that capitalism would be replaced by socialism. In fact, but more important, he said the capitalist process, creative destruction, not only destroys its own institutional framework, but it also creates the conditions for another. Destruction might not be the right word after all. Perhaps I should have spoken of transformation. So he introduced a huge debate in this respect. Braun and Sweezy, Paul Braun and Paul Sweezy in Monopoly Capital tried to answer Schumpeter's points. And they re-emphasized the role of monopoly and stagnation, even the growth of finance under monopoly capital as a key force. And they saw the tendency of the system as a normal tendency towards stagnation under capitalism due to the growth of monopoly, due to concentration and centralization of capital, and the problems that creates because monopoly capital or oligopolistic capital gets higher profit margins. There's the problem of surplus capital absorption, and so on. And the system solves this partly by creating waste in their argument. The assessment, I think, is basically correct. If you looked at in 1950, the top 200 corporations in the United States accounted for about 13% of gross profits in the US, and now they account for 30%. If you look at a world level, the top 500 corporations in 1960 accounted for about 20% of world revenue. They now count for 40%. So we have concentration and centralization occurring both nationally and internationally. Braun and Sweezy answered Schumpeter partly by bringing in technology, by talking about epoch-making innovations. They say the system tends towards stagnation unless there's an epoch-making innovation that that stimulates the system in massive ways, changes the whole geography, the whole way of doing things, change the entire landscape of the system, like the steam engine, the railroad, and the automobile. So within this analysis, the question from the very beginning has been, is the communication revolution an epoch-making revolution in that sense? And it's a really interesting question. Sweezy in 1958 in a pamphlet called, anonymous pamphlet called The Scientific Industrial Revolution, actually made a Schumpeterian argument. In 1958, he basically, he provided probably the greatest anticipation of the communication revolution, saying it was going to transform society. He was talking about, in 1958, of people having pocket computers and a connection between telephony and video and so on, and mobile phones and so on. And he was saying this was what we were going to be seeing. But he never thought that it would actually represent an epoch-making innovation in the economic sense. And so this is a problem. How do we understand this? In the United States, in 1960, if you took information processing equipment and software as a percentage of total private investment in equipment and software, that means basically information and processing and equipment and software as a percentage of all investment outside of structures, then you get that information processing equipment and software represented 16% in 1960, 24% in 1970, 30% in 1980, 41% in 1990, and 50% in 2000. And so in 2000, by 2000, and actually in 2009, it hit 55%. The information processing and software accounts for the bulk of all investment in the economy outside of structures. This is, this begins to look like the railroads, except that this is happening in the context of a stagnation of investment in the economy, of real investment of capital formation, which is actually dropping. So how do we understand that? What is the significance of that? Is there a causal relationship, or are these things happening separately? And I can't answer that for you, but it's one of the things that we have to recognize is that there's a massive cheapening of capital going on, and there's a massive cheapening of labor. And so the profit margins are enormously expanding, and there's this problem of surplus capital absorption. They actually have, the corporations now are sitting on something like $4 trillion in cash that they don't know what to do with. They could invest it, but they don't see the profitable investment opportunities. They had been speculating with it in the financial sector, but now the financial sector is shaky. And so this is fundamental to the problem of the system, why the economy is growing so slowly. If you look at the United States and you look at Western Europe and Japan, you find that the economy grew faster. The real rate of growth was faster in the 1960s than in the 1970s, faster than in the 1970s than in the 1980s and 90s, faster in the 1990s than in the first decade of this century. And it looks like the growth rate is going to be slower in this decade, even slower this decade than the last one. So the entire triad is experiencing a slowdown in economic growth. What we are seeing, in fact, is the undermining of the institutional framework of the system on a planetary scale. We're seeing capitalism's creative destruction. And Schumpeter, at one point in that quote that I gave you, said, well, maybe the destruction is the wrong word. Maybe we should call it, in this sense, transformation, that we're really seeing a transformation of the system. But it's a transformation that's not quite happening because of power relations. In fact, we're in a kind of degenerative spiral, and we have to say that, given the level of unemployment, given the growing inequality, given the fact that we're rapidly destroying the entire planet. So we have this situation of monopoly, stagnation, financialization, excess capacity, enormous profit margins, increased inequality, problems of surplus absorption. The system actually works by producing waste. Waste helps it expand. So we've, in terms of the real economy, to go back to Marx's general formula of capital, we can say we've gone from MCM prime to now MC superscript K M prime. And superscript K, I mean C superscript K means specifically capitalist use values. We're producing use values that are no longer really useful to people in the terms of satisfying their needs, but they're produced mainly because they generate exchange value for capital. I don't have time to develop this, but the waste built into the system is enormous. We spend over $1 trillion a year on marketing. And that's to get people to buy things that they wouldn't normally buy otherwise. We have an environmental crisis at the current rate, and it's speeding up. We will hit the trillionth ton of carbon emissions, which means 2 degrees Celsius increase in atmosphere, which scientists call the point of no return, because the point of irreversibility, because we'll never be able to get back after that point. The ice will melt all over the Earth, the Antarctic and the Greenland ice and the glaciers and the Arctic, and we won't be able to do anything to stop it at that point. 2 degrees Celsius is 28 years away at the current rate, and we're not doing anything about it. We're crossing planetary boundaries all over the place. Species extinction, scientists are talking about the extinction of half of all world species in this century. We're seeing fresh water shortages globally. We're seeing ocean acidification. There's still the ozone problem. There's a loss of land cover. There's increase in toxicity, and so on. These are all planetary boundaries that are critical, and the scientists are concerned with. The phosphorus and nitrogen cycles are entering into a severe state. We have a system of increasingly forcible globalization, symbolized by drone imperialism. We have a global reserve army of labor now, which according to IMF data is 65% of the global workforce. 2.4 billion people can be counted as members of the global reserve army, as compared to only 1.4 billion in the active labor army. We've got, we're talking about the growth of emerging economies, but it's based on increase in inequality in every country on Earth. We're caught in, and this relates to communication, a materiality paradox, where, as Raymond Williams and Julia Chor had emphasized, Raymond Williams said, it's not that we're too materialist, we're not materialist enough, because we're buying things on the basis of their symbolic value and not based on their use values, and we're being taught to do that, and the whole system is geared that way. We have the inversion of production and speculation, the inversion of the real economy and the financial economy, the inversion of use value and exchange value, the inversion of natural material use values and specifically capitalist use values, the inversion of human communication and commercialized communication. Hegel has famously said, and I'm concluding here, is that the real is rational and the rational is real. And the real is rational was taken up by the right Hegelians to defend the conservative the status quo. And the rational is real was taken up by the left Hegelians, out of which Marx came, to say, look, there are possibilities. What is potential is real. That the possibility of moving forward and creating a more rational world, that is real. Well, now we're living in a world where that irony, that paradox is more paradoxical still. The real is irrational according to our society, and they tell you all the time, and live with it. And the rational is unreal. If you propose any kind of rational solutions, they say that's unreal, that can't happen. That's not possible. Saving the planet, that's not realistic. That's not real because it would conflict with economic growth. The real is irrational. They teach us to live in a life of irrationality as a sort of defense of the system. People who study marketing and advertising will understand this. We're told there are no alternatives, that we are all prisoners on a moving train. That train is capitalism, and this is the greatest determinism. But Schumpeter, who was a conservative, agreed with Marx, who was, of course, a radical, that capitalism actually carries out its own creative destruction. It destroys its institutional framework, and we're seeing that now. The system is falling apart, but we have to put something in its place. We have this communication revolution. We have all these capabilities. What are we using them for? The source of revolution doesn't have to do with immiseration or anything like that. The source of revolution in human history is due to the widening gap between the actual and the potential of human society. To the extent that people perceive that the potential of society is far beyond the actuality they're living, they're driven to protest and revolutionary action, as we're seeing in China, in Brazil, and China is having a lot of upheaval. Brazil, Turkey. Business Week interviewed me yesterday. They asked me, what's happening? Can Marxism explain this? Because we can't explain this. And why are they all in revolt? Aren't these emerging economies? But the gap between what is actual and what is possible for people is growing, and they know it. And they know that there is no future on that basis. They know the system is falling apart. Brecht said to describe the present day, Bertolt Brecht said to describe the present day world to present day people, it is necessary to describe it as capable of transformation. If we don't describe the world that way, as capable of transformation, as Marx and indeed Schumpeter, a conservative, did, if we treat the actual world as inevitable and incapable of transformation, then we haven't described the world as a whole. We've abandoned all critical thought, all thought in general, and all possibility, all future, all history. And people are discovering this, and all over the world, the revolts are growing. I think we're seeing revolts now, that, at least in the global south, that exceed in scale what occurred in 1968. Thank you.